to welcome you back to Exploring a Postmodern Gospel. This session we're going to be taking a deep look into the Missio Dei, or the mission of God in the story. If the root problem is our capacity to construct a false reality that invalidates the self, how does God work to solve that problem? During this fifth session, we will be processing chapters 8 and 9. Please post at least one question or observation regarding these chapters in the discussion boards. Then post a response to at least two other participants' questions or observations. At some point this session, finish reading chapters 10 through 12. You'll also explore the session questions in the discussion boards. Once again, I want to invite you to close your eyes and use your imagination for a moment to step into the God imagination. This is life from God's perspective. God first sees you as good. God began the world by embedding into you a deep sense of worth and value. You are created in God's image. You are a child of God. This is your original identity, and you are called for a deeply meaningful purpose to rule over yourself. You're called to live into this purpose on a moment-by-moment basis. God has gifted you with a deep sense of freedom because you are not defined by what you do. Circumstance cannot change your value, your identity, or your purpose, but it can affect you. If you lose sight of your value, you will experience a profound sense of pain and suffering that can often feel overwhelming. But when you hold on to that good, which is established by God, you know it to be true because you will experience a deep sense of peace and harmony with yourself and with others. This is your terra firma, your ground of being. This is God's perspective of what is true. If you want to stop the presentation, simply press the space bar. Feel free to rest in this reality for a moment. I want to encourage you to post another response in the discussion boards regarding what you experienced. When you are ready, you can always come back to this presentation. I want to provide a brief review of the human imagination because it provides a contrast to this session's presentation. As human beings created in the image of God, yet captivated by a false reality, we attempt to solve the problem very differently than God. These patterns are called the way of the world. It's our attempt to get back into the circle. The way of the world works itself out largely as pride, which is our attempt to validate the self through subjective means, but it also shows up as a social comparison, relationship, the law, and religion. Religion is deeply important in the story because it reveals the contractual means we agree with God to be satisfied or appeased. This session we're going to be exploring the Missio Dei, or mission of God. In contrast to the human imagination, which attempts to solve the problem using subjective means, the story begins to shift to God's response. If we understand the root problem God is actually solving, we can begin to see the Missio Dei working itself out in the story. We can begin to call out the little details and common patterns that reveal how God is working to restore humanity. The mission of God actually begins the moment humanity steps into the test, but it kicks into high gear as God engages a select group of people who will reveal what restored relationship with God is like. Much of the story is God working out this relationship in the nation of Israel. God begins by selecting Abraham, a man deeply immersed in the religious system. Abraham's father actually makes idols, but Abraham just doesn't buy it. In other words, God selects someone who can see beyond the human imagination. God invites Abraham to leave his land, which in a Mesopotamian culture is a remarkably stupid thing to do. Leaving means walking away from safety, and yet Abraham goes. He expresses faith in God, which gives him an intrinsic mobilizing story. God invites Abraham into relationship by speaking deeply into his soul. He doesn't come and tell him to bow down and worship. He doesn't call him to appease God in order to gain favor. God begins with blessing. God speaks directly into the root problem in Abraham's heart, and he promises him to make him a blessing. The promise is already true from God's perspective. We know that in hindsight, but for Abraham, he doesn't know it yet. To realize it, he must step out in faith with God. God's promises then are not dependent upon our faith. They are realized by it. God also promises him a son, which for a man of many years is rather absurd. And this is what makes this story so good. Abraham actually leaves. He steps into faith with God even when it doesn't make sense. And it is here that we see faith working itself out. The deepest experience of faith comes when everything suggests it is untrue. God fulfills his promise to Abraham, beginning with the birth of his son Isaac. But immediately God calls Abraham to confront his image of God. He asks him to sacrifice the very son that was promised to him. We wrestle with this moment because of the severity of the request, but it's important to understand that for a man to sacrifice his son is not an uncommon thing. This is what the gods do in the Mesopotamian culture. They demand really important things in order to be appeased. It's also important to realize that the test is not for God. A test is for the test taker. God already knows what is going to happen. So who needs to know he has faith? Abraham does. The test is for Abraham to discover how far he will go. And once he knows he will, God releases him from the test. The purpose of faith is to discover what is real, what is true. Abraham needs to know a different image of God, so when God releases him from the test, he's rewriting his image of God. Suddenly, Abraham is experiencing a God who releases the child, as opposed to demands the child. For Abraham, this is unheard of. It doesn't make sense. The story then turns to Isaac's sons, Jacob and Esau. Where Abraham is the epitome of faith, Jacob is the exact opposite. Jacob provides us with what the normal human being looks like. Jacob gets it constantly wrong. The central tension in the story draws our attention back to the root problem. Jacob longs for and then steals his father's blessing. He becomes the lie. Over and over again, we see this same story played out in the nation of Israel. But because Jacob steals his brother's blessing, he has to live in exile. He runs from the problem instead of facing it. God doesn't forget Jacob. Instead, he gives him a dream that is virtually identical to Abraham's. God gives him the God imagination. But because this is Jacob, it takes him a long time to get it in his head. After 20 years, he finally confronts the problem and sends word to his brother to meet him. God invites him to return to the scene of the crime. And while he's on his way back to meet his brother, the story reveals this strange little tale of Jacob wrestling with someone. But it also says he's not alone. Most people assume it's God or an angel, but the story says it's a man. In other words, the story is suggesting he's wrestling with himself. As they're wrestling all night, the man then asks him a really strange question in light of their argument. He asks, "Jacob, what is your name?" But if we understand the root problem, it makes perfect sense. Jacob is captivated by a lie, and the man is calling him out. When Jacob finally remembers, he's released from his own captivity. Jacob overcomes the root problem. And it is here that we see Jacob discover his true self. The man gives him his new name, which is Israel. The nation of Israel is named after the one who wrestles, not the founder. God names the people of God not after the one who gets it all right, but after the one who represents the path almost everyone will have to make, which is to overcome. The story then turns to Jacob's sons, and he has a lot of them, but it's also once again calling out the root problem, which is the perception of favor. Jacob favors his youngest son Joseph, which infuriates his other sons. The sons conspire against Joseph and almost kill him, but instead sell him into captivity. This narrative reveals Israel's constant process of falling into captivity. Joseph ends up in Egypt, which is the symbol of empire. But it also reveals that even in captivity, God won't forget his people. God is continually reinforcing the idea that he won't forget the promise. The central narrative of the nation of Israel is about coming out of captivity and into relationship, but it's also about the people recognizing their own sense of captivity. When the people cry out to God, God listens and hears their cry. God responds by selecting Moses to lead the people out of captivity. It's important to call something out about the plagues. It's easy to brush up against the notion of God using such horrific means to speak to the empire. But it's also important to recognize that this is the way people see the gods, as powerful. In other words, God uses the people's understanding of power to speak to them. The plagues are a direct confrontation with the idea of captivity and empire. Each plague is a direct confrontation with another god of Egypt. They're not random, but the most important one is the last, which is called the Passover. As much as this is about death, it's also about life. When we align ourselves with God, it produces life over death. It also reveals that reconciliation already exists with God. Once outside of captivity, God reveals the true purpose of Israel. They will be a kingdom of priests. They will serve as the priests for the ultimate sacrifice. They don't know it yet, but they will serve what is arguably one of the most heroic and horrific responsibilities in the human story, the sacrifice of Jesus. It is here that we can begin to see God use the human construct. Religion is not something exclusive to Israel. It's deeply embedded in the Mesopotamian culture. So when God gives Israel the law and the religious system, God is giving a much more holistic version bent towards restoration. Religion is a human construct, but it's a very telling one. It establishes how the human imagination will be appeased. It needs a substitute in the form of a sacrifice. God uses the law to help humanity identify the problem. The law serves to give them a measuring stick to see the problem. Without it, they can't see it. So God also uses religion to help solve the problem. God uses the human construct to meet humanity where it's at. The law and religion suffer from some very significant problems. By its very nature, the law can't save. It can only identify the problem. So by giving it, it actually makes the problem more acute. It creates guilt, which creates the need for a solution. So the law is meant to draw people towards seeking out restoration. Religion suffers from a different problem. Each sacrifice is individualistic in nature. It only covers a single act, so the religious system literally becomes this bloody mess. By using the religious system, God is making them aware of how ridiculous it is. God is allowing the process to exhaust itself. In order to fulfill the religious contract, God needs a select group of people who could perform the sacrifice. The act of the priest was about entering into someone's suffering in order to restore the individual. The priests act as a representative of the people, and this is important because humanity needs a representative. We need someone who can step into our suffering. The role serves to remind us of the act of love. Humanity also needs someone who could act as the priest in the ultimate sacrifice. They don't know it yet, but Israel will ultimately serve as priest to the empire, which is representative of all of humanity. Religion is important because God establishes a very specific ritual for each person to enter into for the sake of restoration. In order to meet humanity in the midst of its suffering, God gives the people a very specific way to know they've gotten out of captivity. The ritual serves the person's need to know they are released. Once again, the religious process is established for the individual. The sacrifice is for the individual. It's not for God. We see this reality in the tabernacle. God's mercy is already present in the symbols. The process calls humanity to be honest about what is harming them, but it also includes recognizing the mercy that is already present. The ark included the law, but it was covered by the mercy seat. God is represented as just, which requires honesty. To engage the religious process meant being honest about what happened. But God is also merciful, which holds on to the judgment of good. To engage the act means the person was worth restoring. It's important to review the problem of guilt. Guilt is a human construct that arises in the mind when we lose our objective basis for judgment. We do something that we assume is wrong. It's the evidence that demands a judgment. We assume this evidence defines us as a person. It's the tree of knowledge all over again. It didn't just happen. It happens. We base our value on the subjective evidence and come to the wrong conclusion. And when we do, we're naturally drawn to wonder God's response. And if we are evil, we wonder if God is going to kill us or remove us altogether. This is the problem of wrath. We project onto God a response based upon our own subjective logic. The religious process is the human construct designed to get rid of the problem. It assumes that God will accept a sacrifice in our place. God doesn't need the sacrifice because God doesn't get it wrong. We do. God meets humanity in the midst of its pain and uses our means of restoration. The atonement doesn't change the past. It changes the judgment we make about the self in light of the past. It shifts our judgment to God's perspective by removing the problem of guilt. The atonement allows us to get over the past so we don't worry about the future. It allows us to live in the present, which is where the presence of God is. It allows us to live in a state of wholeness or righteousness, which is simply being aligned to God's reality. The atonement is essentially a process for overcoming our own imagination. It's a process for us to get over ourselves. This idea of overcoming is central to the human story. Over and over again, we see this idea of overcoming. Israel overcomes its fear to enter the promised land. Israel overcomes the walls of Jericho. Israel overcomes the giant to beat the Philistines. Israel overcomes the surrounding nations. But unfortunately, Israel succumbs to religion. It keeps returning to the gods of the surrounding nations. It keeps returning to the old gods that demand a ruthless sense of punitive sacrifice. As sad as it is, Israel continues to find itself back into captivity. It keeps returning to the old paradigm. It keeps proving out how serious the root problem is. It's important to call out the reality that throughout the story, God does get angry. But God gets angry primarily at the people of Israel for not participating in the Missio Dei. Israel is supposed to reveal what relationship with God looks like, but they keep forgetting God. They keep forgetting to participate with God in the restoration of the people. God also gets angry for the human state of oppression. God continually reveals anger for humanity about sin. God can't stand that humanity is captivated, so God gets angry for the people. God also gets jealous for humanity. We want to know that God is jealous for us because it reveals that God cares about us. We also can't ignore the concept of wrath. Wrath is our instinctive assumption of God's response to the evidence. It's our projection of God's response as opposed to God's actual response. If we begin with the idea that God is angry, it doesn't really matter what God does. We're always going to see God through the lens of anger. We're going to run from God as opposed to run to God. Until we let this image go, we won't find restoration. This is what it means to lose the wrath of God. I want to end this session exploring a story that you've read in the book. My encounter with Bob was a life-changing event because it gave me a very real and tangible event regarding how God works out restoration and healing. When I met Bob, my traditional assumption was that someone could believe a determined script about what Jesus did on the cross and that things would naturally work themselves out. But Bob completely shattered that notion. Everything in his life was about following the script, yet the script was producing no significant changes in his life. And as we began to work together, it was really hard not to notice his anger. It repelled people as much as it drew their attention to him. You couldn't look at Bob without noticing his massive furrowed brow. The creases in his forehead were so dramatic that if you stuck a credit card in them, it would stick. Bob's one life-saving grace is that he just wouldn't quit. No matter how bad the evidence got, he just kept sticking with the script. So when we met, he was willing to try anything. As we began exploring his memory of his final encounter with his mom, I couldn't help but recognize something that I had seen over and over again at the drug rehab center. Each time we would revisit the scene of the crime, what changed was not the event. None of the men could change what had happened. It was still true. What changed was the judgment each man made about the self in the event. And what Jesus provided was the evidence that overwhelmed their old evidence. The presence of Jesus allowed each man to rewrite the story in a way that was healing. But the change was not God's judgment, it was the man's. In other words, the nature of healing was about letting go of the false judgment each man had made about the self in the event, and the only way to change it was to revisit it. When Bob finally found the face of Jesus in the midst of his suffering for the first time, he could begin to see a way out. Jesus was always there. All Bob had to do was look, and when he did, he could begin to work out his own salvation. He began to see what was true for the first time. What changed was his perception of the event, not the reality of the event. But as I sat with Bob, processing what was happening, I couldn't ignore what this moment was saying to me. Restoration is something that happens inside of us. Healing is something that happens when we begin to align our lives to God's reality. The change happens inside of us. God doesn't change. God never forgets my dignity. I do. In the midst of my suffering, it is me that forgets how valuable I am. It is me that forgets who I am. All that happened in Bob was a process of taking off the blinders. Bob rediscovered what was already true. He didn't earn anything. He simply discovered what was real. And when he did, it produced life. It released him from his own captivity. Bob overcame his own imagination. As we draw to a close, I want to once again bring this down to real life. As we begin to explore God's mission of restoration, the real purpose is not just to examine it, but also to engage it. The practice of overcoming begins with returning to the scene of the crime for the sake of rooting out what is untrue. So I want to leave you with a question to ponder and work out in the discussion boards for this session. What is the lie that captivates you? What is the false reality that you've created or accepted specifically that invalidates you and captivates you? This process of self-examination may seem hard at first. Our first thought is often, I'm not captivated. But it's important to remember that the power of the lie resides in its capacity to blind us to its existence. As long as we assume there is nothing there, we remain captivated. I want to give you the space to wrestle with it in the discussion boards, and I look forward to seeing what you discover. At the root of the lie is some judgment we make about the self. We've blown it in some tangible way that we assume defines us forever. Overcoming that judgment is not about producing something better, but by releasing the false judgment. Next session, we're going to be bringing our reflections to the only place designed to receive them, to the cross. Remember, this practice is for you. You only gain by participating. The process of redemption, or trading in a false reality for a true one, only happens when we engage. I want to end this presentation here so we can begin having a conversation about it in the discussion boards. Once again, much love to each of you, and I look forward to our conversations about the gospel.